So suddenly it didn't matter if I was Syrian, Lebanese, Mexican, a woman, a minority, I was a Zionist. I kept thinking, how dumb could they be to take physical action? I understand protests, but at this point you're getting arrested by NYPD. And I thought, okay, we got them. And then I faced the disappointment of that not being enough for the school. And less than a year later, you have Students for Justice in Palestine, led by the same students who got arrested, receiving an award from NYU. If your law against discrimination only protects some minorities and not others, it's a bad law. Our goal with that case was for a judge to rule that when a Jewish person wears an Israeli flag around their neck, it's a symbol of their identity. And we got that ruling. After October 7th, people were siding with Hamas, and we had that moment where we were shocked and said, are you people really siding with Hamas right now? Venezuelans said, are you people really siding with Maduro? Iranians are saying, are you really siding with the IRGC?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Long Path Podcast, where we explore the past, present, and future of Jewish life, peoplehood, and Zionism. I'm your host, Amitai Freeman. Today's guest is Adela Cojab, a Mexican Syrian Jewish activist and legal advocate who has become one of the most prominent voices confronting anti-Semitism on college campuses. Adela first rose to national attention in 2019 while she was a student at NYU, where she filed a landmark Title VI complaint against the university for neglecting its Jewish community's safety. And her case contributed to the executive order on combating anti-Semitism and laid the groundwork for subsequent Title VI cases. She's a media contributor, a social media activist, and a speaker. Adela currently serves as a legal fellow at the National Jewish Advocacy Center, where she manages cases defending Jewish civil rights. In this conversation, we'll talk about anti-Semitism on campus and beyond, and what legal tools can and are being used to confront it. Adela, it's really a pleasure to have you here, truly. Last time we got to hang out was at the Z3 conference, which was a while back, and you got engaged, which is awesome. Mazal tov. That's wonderful. Really, truly, we can always use some good news these days. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amitai, and thank you so much for having me.
This is great. Okay, so look, I want to start a little bit in the beginning, maybe, or in the beginning for you, just to kind of situate this conversation. I'd say most people started noticing anti-Semitism on campus post 10/7. Okay, but what's really interesting about your work and what I slightly described is that you started fighting in 2019. I was in NYU, before that I graduated in 2016 from grad school, and I was already seeing a lot of the stuff. But this is a long time in the making, what we're seeing on campus. So maybe broaden the lens for those who might not be aware that this has been a much longer term problem.
Of course. I mean, I think we've been hearing for over 20 years about what's been happening on campus. I remember when I was in middle school and in high school, I would hear about Berkeley, I would hear about Columbia. I remember when I was applying to schools, my mom said, "Oh, well, you can't go to that school. That school, has a lot of anti-Semitism." And it was just kind of like this general air. And even NYU, the year before I came in, they had to put fake eviction notices under Jewish student dorms. Trying to simulate the pamphlets in Gaza saying that, they're taking people's homes away and taking away their livelihoods. And that's when my brother was at NYU and I was in my application cycle. And it was always something I heard about. I never thought it would be something I would see. And some people say I might have looked for it because I became a Middle Eastern Studies major. So every class I was in was a Middle Eastern Studies class. So on that side, I already knew I was going to be facing hostility. I knew it wasn't going to be a positive place for Israel. I knew signing up to the graduate seminar called Palestine in the History of Politics that things wouldn't be, pleasant for me. But I didn't expect it in my world dance class to do the Palestinian dance of resistance. I didn't expect it in my creative writing class to take a section called How the Political is Personal and reading essays about the Palestinian struggle. And I realized that it was slowly starting to make its way into mainstream classes. And it was so confusing to me. It was confusing to me because, I came from a Syrian Jewish community. The women in my community don't really go to college. And I went to NYU looking for this liberation for where I'm going to be part of this wonderful progressive world of America. And instead, I found that the progressive world of America was turning into a basket of causes. And if you didn't align with every single cause in that basket, you weren't allowed in that basket. So suddenly it didn't matter if I was Syrian, Lebanese, Mexican, a woman, a minority, Hispanic. I was a Zionist Jew,
Mm,
and that kept me out of that bucket. And when I started talking about what was happening at NYU, right, we had a flag burning, assault and battery, every event being protested. People kept telling me, wow, this is crazy. Why isn't anyone doing something about it? And, fast forward 4 years after I filed my lawsuit against NYU, October 7th, where every campus exploded, I kind of felt vindicated. I felt vindicated, but I felt very sad because suddenly I knew exactly what every student was feeling in that moment.
that's it's terrible. I mean, I that really resonates because I also kind of heard, coming from Israel, I heard about, as a advocacy activist in undergrad, Stand With Us, which was great, and they kind of prepared us. We're talking about the campuses, and I saw it, and I was like, this is really really bad, but it does feel like it was getting worse, and it sounds like today it's kind of reached maybe the peak of it. And I know you've been out of campus for a while now, but do you have a sense from your friends and networks like what's going on today? Is it still as bad? Is it getting better in a way, or is it still
So it's a yes and no. It's a yes and
okay?
no. So since I filed my lawsuit against NYU, I worked for 2 years as an activist with the Maccabee Task Force. Then I decided to leave all that behind. COVID hit. I said, okay, it's my time now. I changed the law on a national level. I'm going to go to law school. And I went to law school. My goal was not to work in anything advocacy related. I was going to be a
Mm,
prosecutor. I did all of my internships in district attorneys' offices. I got my offers for after graduation. Then October 7th changed everything for me.
mm,
Now I full time work on anti-Semitism law, and I speak to students almost on the daily. We're going
okay.
through similar things on campus. And I think what I found is that the baseline has changed. So, for
Okay.
example, before when a BDS resolution was presented on a student government, that would be headline worthy. That would be, Times of Israel coming out with a headline about how University of Michigan is trying to pass BDS. I remember these headlines. I remember when NYU tried to pass BDS, I spoke to so many reporters and how many articles came out. Now students reach out to me and they say, I feel uncomfortable because my student government is trying to pass BDS. And we say, well, it's within their right. Right. So I think that
Mhm.
the level of alarm has really, the baseline has gone much higher. You need a higher baseline of something alarming. It's not enough that, oh, they're anti-Zionist. I need to hear that they harassed you individually, which is crazy when I talk to someone and they're telling me about a hostile environment on campus. And I say, guess what? The environment's not enough anymore. At the
Mm.
same time, I'm seeing so many students that are much more aware and much stronger than any of the students that I had when I was in college, any of my peers, and stronger than me. These kids call it out right away, and they're calling to ask about their rights and when it's okay to file a lawsuit. They say, is my case actionable yet? Is this enough yet? When I
Interesting.
feel like when I was coming up 6 years ago, we were very afraid of any sort of legal action. We tried to do everything through the school. We tried to exhaust all internal processes. And now the kids understand that they have rights and they're ready to use them.
That's really interesting. So what I kind of hear you're saying, and I correct me if I'm wrong because I could be wrong. In a way, like giving it the Title VI gave it a much more definitive legal framework. And so on the one hand, that means that the baseline is elevated because the law has to rise to a certain bar in order to be kind of you know that you can prosecute it through the law. But at the same time, because of that, it also put into sharper view what are the issues, and because that it also empowered students now to act in a certain way. So it kind of net positive, obviously, but also raised kind of the sense of the baseline. Is that kind of an accurate?
100%.
Got it.
100%. And we even have high school students that are coming to me saying, I think my high school violated Title VI. And to
I
have a
see.
high school student come to you with a potential Title VI against, these kids are 16.
Yeah,
That's amazing bravery. And it's a shame. It's a shame that our students have to be this strong, but I'm very proud and I'm here to be a resource for them wherever it is that they're coming from.
that's
So,
awesome.
so you're
That's great.
100% right.
That's good. Okay, so look, we did it. That was a great, foundation laying. We kind of get the big picture. I do want to zoom in a little bit to your experience at NYU because I think it's a very interesting story. One, and also it does point to unique elements that I think are worth repeating. So, you described that you were there, that you heard about this from your brother who was there. There were already cases going on, but what was the moment maybe they can take us back when you're like, oh, this is different, right? Like it's not just campus politics, but it's a civil rights issue. Like what was the moment where this became crystal clear to you?
It's a good question. I think the progression with us, it started with BDS on student government and mentioning Zionism in the same category as fascism and racism. And that's where we said, okay, we're on the campus politics side of this. We have to stand up for ourselves, put our own definition forward, show them how disappointed we are that they can't understand what Zionism is for the Jewish people. Um, but then suddenly every event we had was being protested. Like even a
Mm,
Shabbat dinner that we hosted, someone stood up with their cell phone and started reading an anti-Zionist manifesto. And how disrespectful can you be to come to our Shabbat table as a guest to stand up with your phone to read something against our people?
yeah.
So that I think was when I realized things are not going to be pretty. Any event we hosted would have a protest element to it. And leading up to Yom Ha'atzmaut, that's really when I got worried. Because
Mm,
Yom Ha'atzmaut, we rent out Washington Square and we throw a massive party for 300 students. We fly a
right.
DJ in from Israel. We've been doing it for years. There was always, a little bit of a counter protest, maybe 20 people. But that year, I really felt afraid. And I knew it was going to be different. I was meeting with the school. I said, this could have real world consequences. This can actually be an unsafe environment. And lo and behold, I was right because the event kicked off with an anti-Israel student burning an Israeli flag and throwing gasoline on it. And then another student during Hatikva coming to the center, grabbing the microphone from a Jewish girl, yelling Free Palestine, and NYPD arresting two students for property theft and damage, reckless endangerment, and assault and battery.
Wow.
So once NYPD stepped in, that was, I actually remember perfectly the day after the rave in the park, the day after all of this happened and the police got involved. And it sounds dramatic because it was pretty much our event was supposed to last until I think 2, 3 p.m. But we felt the protest getting much bigger than the amount of people we were. We were maybe 200 people. The protest was going to be larger than what we were.
Wow.
And that's when we said, you know what, let's wrap it up early. We got in a circle and we started singing Hatikva. And that's when the assault happened. That's when the
Mm,
police stepped in. That's when the protesters tried to break through the protest line and the police started pushing them back. It was chaotic. It was scary. I could tell you the Jewish students in the park felt afraid. And I remember the meeting I had the next day. I called a meeting with the Jewish community of NYU, which sounds so broad because it is. I literally just said, like, meeting tonight, whoever wants to come. And I remember walking around saying, they really messed up. Like, if there ever was a line to cross, that line has been crossed. And I kept thinking, how dumb could they be to take physical action? I understand protests, but at this point, you're getting arrested by NYPD. And I thought, okay, we got them. We got them. And then I faced the disappointment of that not being enough for the school, of meeting with the school and saying, the police has stepped in, there's been two arrests. What are you going to do about it? And the school saying they were going to take action behind the scenes. And I was so weak and so desperate that I said, I trust you. Do what you need to do behind the scenes, wherever it needs to be. Just make sure the community is safe. And less than a year later, you have Students for Justice in Palestine, led by the same students who got arrested, receiving an award from NYU less than a calendar year later. That's when I thought really the line was crossed. Because the line was crossed when the police stepped in. I decided to trust the school, and the school couldn't even refrain from celebrating their quote unquote activism.
Yeah,
All
it's
they had
it's
to do was
really
do nothing.
it's really unbelievable. I've heard, this story. You also wrote it in parts of it in the chapter in Young Zionist Voices. But every time I hear it, every time I encounter it, it's just like it's really it baffles me every time. And so you're describing like first relying on the school, but then you ultimately turned to the legal system, right? And you're like, okay, if this is and that happened after the award, before the award, like what was
It was after.
yeah,
Actually,
after the award?
when the assaults first happened and NYPD stepped in, a law firm had reached out to me and they
Oh
said, if
wow.
you want to file a case, this might work. But at the time, I wasn't ready to do that. I really thought NYU had my best interest in mind. So I said, thank you, no thank you. And they said, keep our number on your back burner. And I did.
Yeah.
And I left everything. I told you, I left student government. I was vice president of my sorority. I couldn't even do that because I was scared to be on campus. I
It's
left
insane.
every leadership position I had. I stacked my classes to 2 days a week so I could get in and get out. I really changed my whole college experience because of this for
Right.
NYU to give the award. And
Right.
that's when I decided to make that phone call. I called that same law firm. I asked, do I have a case? And they explained it was not going to be easy. They said, the law does not exist. Again, we talk about Title VI now because the executive order changed the framework. It changed, instead of changing Title VI, it changed the definition of Judaism.
Mm,
So when Title VI protects nationality, ethnicity, and race, Judaism was considered a religion. It changed Judaism to an ethno-religion. So now we
mm,
get ethnic protections. It's a very crafty way to reach the same result.
yeah.
And pretty much that's the hoop I knew I had to jump through. And
Yeah.
actually, if you end up reading through my case, I don't use the word anti-Semitism once. I say discrimination against my national origin and my shared ancestry, because
Mm.
those were the elements that we were trying to prove under the existing Title VI framework.
Interesting.
Um, it's again now as a lawyer, it's funny when I look back to myself at 21 trying to navigate this. The only thing I remember feeling was there's no way that you can assault a group of students on campus and just get away with it that easily, because it shouldn't be that way. And
Right.
even if the tables were flipped, I always ask myself, have I ever seen a Jewish student on a campus burn a Palestinian flag? I never have. Not after October 7th, not before all of this happened, not now, not at no point have I seen any headline at any point of a Jewish student burning a Palestinian flag, because
Yeah.
that would be appalling.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. The whole thing is the dynamics of the whole thing are always so shocking, and it's so. I mean, it's shocking and it's obvious. I mean, obvious, predictable, right? And we'll get into that in a minute. But I actually this was great because you began kind of expanding what is Title VI, right?
Yes.
There's I'm certainly not a lawyer. I had a funny case in and it's like in this was in 2015 I think, and like people were using a lot of the like microaggression language at the
Yeah.
time in one of my classes at NYU, and probably anti-Semitism. I don't know, whatever. But we had this HR class, and we're supposed to do like role playing. Okay, so we went up there, and someone was supposed to be firing someone's supposed to be the person being fired, and the idea was try to like figure out how are we going to respond as managers in the moment, right? And I was
Mm.
asked to be the person that was going to be fired. Whatever, went through the whole thing, and I am not in any like I went entirely out of my comfort zone, and I was an exaggerated kind of. I did
Yeah.
the whole thing. It was great, and it was a lot of fun. And as I'm walking back, one of my classmates said to me something like they're like they I think the lecturer was like, oh, you're a rabbi or rabbi in training, whatever, and the person looked at me, and this person was of Middle Eastern origin, and
Mhm.
said to me, oh, you're not a lawyer? I thought you were a lawyer. you know Wearing a
Yeah.
kippah, being visibly Jewish, the whole thing, like the assumption of like Jews are lawyers was very much there. And I was like, is that a micro? I don't know what that is, but it just like this whole thing of like this projection of it. But for the rest of us who aren't lawyers, that was a long way of saying I'm not one. um, can you expand a little bit more about Title VI? Because what you're saying is incredibly interesting. First of all, what it is, but the
Mhm.
use of the law is very creative. And here there are parallels to the rabbinic, to any legal system, right? If you can't change one definition, then how do you change the reality to fit into an existing definition so it works and applies? So walk us through that a little bit, kind of break it down so we can do a better job understanding next time we hear Title VI, what that means.
Absolutely. So Title VI says that every institution that receives federal funding has an obligation to uphold the Civil Rights Act, which protects nationality, ethnicity, and race. So schools, whether they're public or private, all receive federal funds, which means that they're beholden onto
Mm,
Title VI.
okay.
And a Title VI violation, the line has already been drawn, and it's when it rises to the level of harassment. And the line is that there has to be discrimination and harassment, university knowledge of discrimination and harassment, and then lack of action or actions that actually make it worse. So you have to prove the university knowledge element. But ultimately, you have to show that you didn't have access to the same academic experiences as other people due to the discrimination and harassment. So, if you take, for example, NYU, you had discrimination and harassment where Jewish students are being kept out of certain spaces. People are saying no Zionists allowed. All of our events are being protested, so we feel like we're being harassed. You have university knowledge of me meeting with the school multiple times to let them know that this is happening. Then you have assault, flag burning, NYPD arrests, university knowledge of it, and then nothing from the school. So
Mm,
on paper, my case is a textbook Title VI case. But unfortunately, at the time, Judaism was a faith and not a nationality, ethnicity, and race. And I really do believe that there's a problem with the way that Title VI conceptualizes what discrimination is. Because, take, for example, someone who is a hijabi convert. So imagine a white woman born and raised in the United States, converts to Islam, wears a hijab. If she gets harassed and assaulted for being a hijabi on campus, she is not protected under Title VI because it's
mm,
not her nationality, it's not her ethnicity, and it's not her race. It's her religious practice. Same
wow.
thing if they have a menorah and someone knocks a menorah over, that's based on a religious identity. So that first step of redefining an ethno-religion like Judaism to be an ethno-religion opens a door for so many people who don't have the nationality, ethnicity, race element to protect them from discrimination. If your law against discrimination only protects some minorities and not others, it's a bad law. And unfortunately, we can't change those laws. That has to go through the House of Representatives, the Senate. It has to be ratified by the president. It's a lot to pass a new law. It takes a
Right.
lot. But what you can do is change definitions. And that's what the Trump administration did in 2019. They had already been working on it for I don't know how long, but ultimately they needed something to attach it to. They needed something to show why it's relevant to do this. And you know Trump, he likes to bring examples. If he's doing something for veterans, he'll point out a veteran family, he'll talk about them, maybe bring them up, and then he'll announce what he's doing to help veterans. So
Right.
ultimately, that was my case. When
Mm.
I filed my case, the Trump administration got wind, and they essentially said, "This is what we've been looking for." And it was right up on the last, his towards the end of his third year, going into his last year as president. So he was campaigning hard, and it came at a good time for him. And I think just on the politics side, a lot of people say, "Don't you realize you were being used?" I wish every administration would have used me the same way. I wish that Title VI protected Jews under the Obama administration. I wish that when Joe Biden was president and Kamala Harris was vice president and every campus erupted in anti-Semitism, they actually applied that definition, but they chose not to. So when good change comes from a place you might not love, you should encourage more good change and not
Right.
just hate its source.
Right.
So that's at least how I conceptualized it.
Yeah.
So that's Title VI in a nutshell. And if
Yeah.
you're a student on campus and you're listening to this and you think you might have a Title VI violation, ask yourself, was there discrimination and harassment? Was I deprived of an academic opportunity that other people have access to because of that discrimination or harassment? Was the university aware of it? And what did they do once they were made aware? That is the Title VI framework.
That's so crystal clear. So I have a question and a comment. The question is, in NYU's defense, like when they were presenting their defense, did they claim that they did something? Was that their line of defense? In other words, that they did take action? And what did they say that they do, or was it a different one entirely?
So I was not in the room for those conversations, unfortunately. The way that my
Okay.
case ended was after the executive order, NYU immediately asked to settle, and their settlement was entirely policy change, which was the
Mm.
only thing I sued for. The only thing I asked for in my case was for NYU to change its policies. I wanted a definition of Zionism, a definition of Judaism, and for that to be included in their discrimination and harassment policies for anti-Semitism, because they did not have an anti-Semitism policy.
Right.
They, I would say, met me halfway. They did not talk about Zionism in their policy. They did define anti-Semitism in a very wishy-washy way, and they did include that in their discrimination and harassment policy. So it was a very small
Mm.
baby step. But I felt it
Okay.
was enough of a win with the executive order that my case kind of didn't really matter. The filing of my case mattered more than its outcome. But if you
Right.
fast forward, the best defense against a Title VI case for a university is saying that they were not aware, or if they were aware, they weren't given a chance to act. So that's
Mm.
actually what happened after October 7th. Almost every student gets up in arms and sues their schools, rightfully so. And the schools defended themselves by saying, we didn't have enough time to react. This was happening across the country. We were never faced with something like this. Encampments across our campuses with hundreds of students. We didn't know how to respond. And within 2 months, we have a case against us. What did they expect us to do? And for the
Mm.
most part, that defense worked for a lot of schools,
Wow.
except for NYU. Because NYU was already on notice of an issue with anti-Semitism because of my case 5 years earlier. So they couldn't say, we didn't know this was happening on our campus. So instead, NYU was one of the first cases to settle, and they included in their settlement a Zionism definition. And in their discrimination policy, it says Zionism is an integral part of many Jewish student identities, and excluding students on the basis of their Zionism is discrimination under NYU's policy.
So this happened
Amazing.
later. This wasn't your, this was later when they were
This
sued
was
again.
much later. This is the
Got it.
post-October 7th
Got
settlement.
it. Okay.
And I
Okay.
remember exactly when I was when it came out. It was August, and I was on vacation with my family, and people just start sending me an NYU link, and I start reading through it, and I said, "Wow, I could not have written it better myself." And that I think was going, or hopefully going, to set a precedent for the way that other schools reacted.
Mm.
But unfortunately, every school took their own path. We didn't see a cookie cutter solution for anything. A lot of the Title Sixes were dismissed in the last 3 weeks of the Joe Biden administration, and they can't be
Right.
refiled because of statutes of limitations. So it was, the victories for the initial Title Sixes after October 7th were bittersweet. They weren't what we were hoping for. It wasn't a resounding support. But I think what we're seeing on campus now is administrators who are not looking to privilege activism anymore. Administrators who want to run their school, get their rankings up, and they're caring less about these external issues.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear that. First of all, I think, look, when you're an activist, you have to, it's more than a marathon. It's an ultra marathon, but being able to like recognize the wins along the way is really important. And I think the fact that you certainly started something that is going to cascade and make a difference, even if you're not going to see, these big cases, the fact that they're not going to privilege these activists is already a win, right? Because you're going to stop it before it happens, as opposed to just reacting when it does happen. I just noticed that, what to me was interesting, and this is something just is a curiosity to me more than anything. It's neither here or there necessarily, but for me, like the way you defined, uh, the evolution of the definition of Judaism from faith to an ethno religion. I mean, that's as close as we can get to like Jewish peoplehood, I think.
Yeah.
And as someone who comes from Israel, that's the only way I know how to think about my Judaism. Yes, I'm an observant Jew, whatever, all that, but like I don't know how to separate the different parts of my identity, and I find it to be incredibly, in American context. I don't know about other countries or other diasporas because I haven't lived there, but in American context of like separating, it's a very almost Christian way of looking at Judaism, right? It's another denomination, and this separation between like who we are as people, and then like we have this mantle that we wear sometimes, which is our Jewish faith, and it's just like remarkable. This is what it takes to kind of remind ourselves that being Jewish is a much more, I'd say, it's an embodied experience. And it doesn't matter if you're practicing or not, but there are elements that are just kind of existing and should be existing as part of who we are. And I'm curious if that's kind of how it resonates with you, also because of your background and your upbringing and where that whole part of your story, or is this just something else that is out there?
100%. I am extremely proudly a Syrian Lebanese Jew. And when it comes to Sephardic Jews, we don't really separate into denominations. That the Ashkenazi community has separated into Orthodox, modern Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and each one has their own set of values and their own set of practice, which is their main difference, right? They all have similar values, similar, they have the same core beliefs, but ultimately, if I tell a person who's Reform, hey, you probably shouldn't be playing music on Shabbat with a microphone, they'll fight me to the death. The same way that if I tell someone who's, ultra Orthodox or Orthodox, hey, technically a Tesla is electric and it's a shvut. So if you open it with like your shoulder and yesh bo tzorech, it's actually okay. They'll tell me I'm insane. When it
Yeah.
comes to Sephardim, we just have a scale where we understand there's a best way. There's a best way. Where do you fall on it? I'll never tell you it's okay to use your phone on Shabbat. Will I keep using my phone on Shabbat? Absolutely. One day I aspire to not to. Will it actually happen? I don't know, maybe. But that's I think how I always conceptualize my Judaism because I'm
Hmm.
Sephardic. So I always went to a school that was religious, that separated men and women for all of our Judaic studies classes, which were half of the day, but we were together during general studies classes. We wore skirts below the knee. We always had to cover halfway to our elbow. We had to cover up to here. And as soon as I left, I'd put on shorts and I'd walk outside. And that's what most of my friends did too, right? So my mom always said, we're sending you to a more religious school than what we are. So you learn about all of the rules and it's up to you on how practicing you want to be. And that's always how it was. That's how Syrians are. I know Syrians who don't eat out. I know Syrians who party in Ibiza on, Sukkot and Shavuot because they're not, the real holidays in their minds, right? But end of the day, we all agree that we're all Jews and no one really judges each other. And I think that that's one thing that's missing on the Ashkenazi side. I think that there's a lot of
Yeah.
judgment to the other quote unquote sects.
Yeah.
But I do think October 7th really changed that. I think at that point, no one cared what denomination you were. I think that it actually was a time for the Orthodox, modern Orthodox, and conservative Jews to embrace their friends that were more on the left spectrum who
Hmm.
suddenly felt betrayed and they had to reckon with that moment of maybe I'm not part of this world and maybe that Jewish identity I have is more salient than I expected. And I think that we did do a good job of embracing them, but there was also a lot of blame of saying, "Oh, see, this is what happens when you vote for bad politicians or for certain policies or you really thought they would accept you. You're just
Right.
a Jew."
Right.
And I think we could have done better. I think we did a good job, but we should have done better.
Yeah. Yeah. So I appreciate that. And I think that like it takes sometimes the law and sometimes it takes like negative dangerous, kind of external threats to remind us who we are. And I appreciate that. I mean, Michal Bitton recently wrote a piece about this, and I don't want to just, we can, but we don't need to go down this rabbit hole of like, but what she describes in Sapir as like the future of Judaism is Sephardi. And I have there's some interesting, points in there, but for me, what's most, compelling is this embodied and, experience of Judaism, which is like kind of total and not experienced just as either a commodity or
Yeah.
just a faith in religion. But I want to kind of bring us back a little bit more to Zionism and the law a little bit, because what we're seeing, so it's great. So Title VI now, through this kind of ethno-religion kind of category, we can fit ourselves in, but anti-Zionism is not quite there yet. I mean, NYU, you described, did a better job at kind of including it. That's good. That's a good step. But broadly speaking, there's still kind of a distinction. So how do you think about that from a legal perspective or legal terms?
Yeah, so the thing again comes down to definitions. So, at
Okay.
least for example, in Title VI, now Judaism is included, and certain states have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And then again, in Title VI, the IRA definition technically does apply because Trump's executive order is the IRA definition paraphrased.
Right. So
Um,
just for those who are not familiar with exactly the IRA definition, yeah.
Yes, so the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance came out with a definition of anti-Semitism that is seen to be broadly by the Jewish community as the most complete, not because of the way it defines anti-Semitism or Judaism or
Okay.
Zionism, but because it includes 13 examples of how anti-Semitism manifests. And I think that anyone who's learned anything about Jewish history knows that anti-Semitism can shift, right? And whatever the bad thing is in society, the Jew becomes. So if you're in a society where, everyone is downtrodden, then the Jew is the capitalist that sucks the money from the top. If you're in a
Right.
society that's relatively wealthy and working class, the Jew becomes the bottom feeder that sucks the money from the bottom, right? If
Right.
the bad thing is nationalism, then the Jews creating a nation is actually colonialism. And if the bad thing is patriotism, then every Jewish Zionist is suddenly, betraying their country. And that's what it is. Whatever you're looking for, capitalism, socialism, colonization, assimilation versus, non-assimilation, the Jew can be, because we know Judaism isn't a monolith. So it's insane to say that, because in a way, every single anti-Semite is correct in that there will be a Jew that meets their definition, because we're not a monolith. There are Jews who are wealthy. There are Jews who are not wealthy. There's, but the difference is their framing. So the issue with anti-Semitism is that it keeps transforming. And the reason why IRA helps is because it's 13 examples of the way that anti-Semitism manifests, shows the
Mm.
way that anti-Semitism can actually be applied. And that's why whenever we push for any sort of policy, legislation, anything, or settlement, we always push for the IRA definition with its examples, because it's the most robust way to make sure that everyone's protected. I always,
So
I speak a lot. I've spoken a couple of times at the city council, at the Senate, at the House Judiciary, and they always ask me, there's a lot of definitions of anti-Semitism, and sometimes they put me on a panel with people who are against the IRA definition and are
I
putting
was
their
going to
own
ask that.
definition forward.
I was
Yeah,
going to
like
ask
the
that.
Nexus
Why?
definition you might have heard of.
Yeah.
There's one I think called like the Jerusalem definition,
Platform.
something.
Yeah. Something. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's all
Well,
these different definitions, and every single time I start by telling a 3-minute version of my story at NYU, and then I turn around and I say, if your definition would not have protected me on campus, it's a bad definition.
mm,
Because then why are we here? So I think that that's the best way to do it. And I've prepped a lot of students that have gone to testify on the Hill, and I tell them every single time, you're going to be on a panel with adult intellectual professionals who have been doing this for 30 plus years. We haven't even been alive for 30 years. And I want you to speak from the point of view of yourself and say, we can speak about ideology and definitions and keep it in the abstract, or we could bring it down to the practical and real world, which was my experience and what I saw on campus. Do you want
right.
to protect a student like me, or do you want to be discussing semantics? And it
Mm,
always helps center the conversation back. So IRA, I think, still continues to be the most robust. Could there be a better definition? Yes. Is it going to be a better definition that could be accepted by the masses or adopted by a government? Likely not. So I'm a big proponent of IRA.
right.
The definition really matters. It really does. And that takes me back to, Title VI essentially has adopted IRA. Title VII, which is employment discrimination, has not. So what
Oh,
I'm working right now with the National Jewish Advocacy Center, one of our biggest focus points are to bring hybrid Title VI to Title VII cases. So a case that is a Title VI and a Title VII together, they're relatively hard to find, but we do get a number of them. And when we bring them, we argue before the court. It would be stupid to argue different definitions of the same thing because different provisions adopt different definitions for Judaism. That doesn't seem like it's practical. You want to
right.
try everything in the same set of facts under the same definitions. And basically, what we're trying to do is expand the adoption of IRA into other provisions of the law. And for the most part, the court does end up being receptive. They understand that defining things differently for the same set of facts isn't going to be helpful.
Yeah, and soon enough you're gonna find that case. It's just a matter of time until someone says something. I mean, it's like I remember seeing at some
Yeah.
point, on LinkedIn, like a quarter of hiring managers don't want to, don't want to interview a Jewish person, like some like ridiculous number, and like that. Though it's just gonna at some point it's gonna come up, if it's not already. So I think so. So if the IRA definition is great, it gives examples, which I think allows people to recognize it when they see it, and as it morphs, which is great. So I think part of it's also like there's language, I'd say moral political language that is institutions are not yet ready to use that are kind of standing in front of it. So we started moving to this, this part of the conversation, which I think is what I think people are going to try to walk away with because it can be. I mean, I'm walking away with a lot of hope, but I think it can be a little frightening and depressing for people. But do you think that the system, based on what you're seeing, it can change and it can deliver ways to fight anti-Semitism through the existing systems? Like, where are we with that?
I think yes, and I think it's about being creative. There's
That's
a
good.
lot of really great organizations in the Jewish legal space that are fighting anti-Semitism and taking anti-Semitism cases. But what makes the National Jewish Advocacy Center different, and the reason why I chose to work with them, is because they're the entrepreneurs of the legal space. And what we
Okay.
do is we don't take a case that's, big and fancy and winnable. What we try to look for is a way to apply a new area of the law to anti-Semitism or to revive old provisions of the law. So, for
Mm,
example, there's hundreds of protest cases, right? Jewish people assaulted by protesters, hundreds of them. Which one did we take? The only case we took was a Jewish woman wearing an Israeli flag that was pulled from her by a protester. Not the craziest case. Not the craziest case. But our goal with that case was for a judge to rule that when a Jewish person wears an Israeli flag around their neck, it's a symbol of their identity. And
mm.
we got that ruling. So now the Jewish flag, at least in this district, is considered an identity of Judaism when it's worn by a Jewish person. And we
Yeah, the
can
Israeli
start
flag.
building on
Yeah,
that case law. Everything ends up building. Next, protests outside of synagogues. How many protests have we seen outside of synagogues, even after October 7th? But more recently, in the last couple of months, Park East Synagogue in New York, a synagogue in Queens,
right, right.
right? And everyone said, well, they have the right to protest. They do. But can we go after these protesters? Can you protest outside a house of worship? The answer technically is yes, except abortion law. In abortion law, it says you cannot protest outside of an abortion clinic. And then separately, it says you cannot protest outside of a house of worship. But it doesn't repeat the word abortion. So we're arguing
Mm.
that that creates an independent protection for houses of worship against protests. Now, will that work? I don't know. We're in the process of this case. We don't know if it'll take it, but we made so much noise around it that now New York has signed into law a buffer zone for houses of worship because we brought that into the context of the conversation, right? We brought it into everyone's consciousness. So the cases that we take at the National Jewish Advocacy Center reframe the way that the laws have been used and apply it to us. I think ultimately, people are very pessimistic, but we live in the United States of America, and the United States of America has amazing laws that do protect people against discrimination. But Jewish people have been asleep at the wheel, and we haven't been using those protections. We're not fighting for a special protection, we're fighting for an equal protection under the law that every other minority group has been entitled to since the beginning. So that's how I like to frame it. I think that the more we start waking up and using our rights, the more we'll be able to exist in this country as our free selves instead of feeling like they're icing us out. Everyone
Yeah.
always says, when things get dangerous, should we all just make aliyah? Should we all make aliyah? And we talk about this all the time, right? When things get dangerous on campus, should we all just send our kids to Yeshiva University or to school in Israel and then they'll come back? Absolutely not. The country is built for minorities to succeed, but minorities have to want to succeed. We saw that economically, we see it culturally. Now we have to see it legally. The country and the system is built to protect minorities. We just have to get up and use those rights that were already given to us.
Yeah, that's very powerful, Adela. So we identified in this conversation some gaps, certainly in the beginning around university, and also now through the system. We talked about, some gaps in the definitions. But what do you think is the biggest gap in the system? Is it enforcement? Is it in the language of the law? Is it the fact that it's not uniform? You talked about Title 6 and Title 7. Like, where do you think is the biggest gap?
All of them, but absolutely enforcement. Because you can have the right language with the right law, with the right set of facts. And if no one's willing to enforce it, then you
Mm,
have nothing there. And that's actually what we saw after October 7th. I can't tell you how many people called me saying, didn't you already sue for this? What happened to that law? What happened to that law? And I said, well, that law is not being used. So you can
yeah,
have all the laws in the books, but if the person who's driving the car isn't ready to enforce them, then nothing happens.
yeah.
So unfortunately, I hate to say it, but it really does matter who is in office. It does, which is the reason why I'd rather activate than retreat.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that comes down to like this whole like the question of how change happens. And it's very clear to me that, systems are, systems are built of people and people are, we're all designed for self-preservation and so are institutions. And so what will force people to shift is actual external pressure. Like, it's not going to be some kind of goodwill internal. There might be a good, the Trump example is interesting because of the confluence of interest. Like he's campaigning and you have a case, like who cares? At the end of the day, you need
Mhm.
this change to happen. It's going to take all kinds of different reasons for it to come together. And so, like in this, if we're looking at the gap of enforcement, so what would be that change or that policy change that you think would make that difference? I mean, there is who's in office, but is there anything else? Because for me, I'm hearing you speak, and part of it's like all this coincides also in the time when police, which are the enforcement in many cases, are being kind of, there's the protests against police and defund them and whatever and all this stuff, and it's like okay, they're like we don't need to add another situation where the police officer is being filmed doing something, enforcing law in a way. So like there's kind of this like we're caught in the middle of this. So again,
Yeah.
the question is for me is like what can be done aside from hoping that the right person is in office to structure and create the conditions for better enforcement.
So the answer I think might be a little bit surprising to you. I think that you're right. The enforcement mechanism is flawed because it's looked down upon. So if we
Mm,
want to help our case in any way, when we align ourselves with enforcement, it doesn't really help us. I think that the key to the gap is unlikely allies. And if you take a step back, think
okay.
about the people who, you think are against us currently, right? You think about the Hispanic community, you think about the Arab community. Historically, if we align ourselves with law enforcement, those are the people who are going to be against us. Okay. Take a step back and understand what's happened over the last 4 months alone. We had Venezuela, Iran, and Cuba. And suddenly, if you open TikTok and Instagram, it's full of Venezuelans, Iranians, and Cubans telling Americans that America is taking the right actions. And
Mm.
suddenly it's that moment that Jews were feeling, when after October 7th, people were siding with Hamas. And we had that moment where we were shocked and said, are you people really siding with Hamas right now? Venezuelans said, are you people really siding with Maduro? Iranians are saying, are you really siding with the IRGC? And now Cubans are saying, are you really siding with the Cuban government that has been a dictatorship, downtrodden our people where we are fleeing on boats? And those are the unlikely allies because they're finally feeling that moment, that breaking point that we felt after October
Mm.
7th. And guess what? They're Hispanic and they're Middle Eastern. So I think we finally have to turn to them. I moved to Miami. I'm a new Miami native now, which is fun. I'm, hopefully going to change my taxes over next year. But being here in Miami, I realized that because
Yeah.
get out of the airport, I hopped into my Uber when I first moved here, and the guy who was driving, Cuban, looks at me and he says, "Is that a Star of David?" I always wear my Star of David. I said, "Yes, it is." He pulls one out this big, studded in diamonds, and said, "Well, mine's bigger than yours." And I said, "That's really cool. That's really
Yeah.
cool." And the conversations I've had in Ubers here in Miami with Venezuelans and Cubans have been some of the most eye-opening conversations for me because I realized, no, we really aren't alone. America isn't that big bad wolf that hates everyone else in the world and the world hates us. The people who left those countries to this country are extremely grateful for what Trump is doing right now and for the way that America is protecting the interest of freedom and the value of being able to have self-determination, which is the same thing that Jews have been screaming from the rooftop. I came to this country for safety. That's what I value about being here. That's what Venezuelans value. That's what Cubans value. That's what Iranians value. And they're all expats. So I think the gap in enforcement, we can't really change that. But the way that enforcement is viewed, we can change that because we
Mm,
have the new unlikely allies that are being ousted from groups that they were previously part of. And I love, 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 love watching liberal white rich girls talking about the importance of supporting Cuba and supporting Iran and supporting Maduro from Venezuela. While
yeah,
other people stare at them and say, "Wow, I guess my experience are completely invalid." So
yeah.
that's been very fun living here in Miami, and I think that it all plays part of this larger context. So we can't change enforcement, but we can change the way that enforcement is viewed, and I think that we're going to have a lot of allies in that space.
That's really interesting. So if you're advising the Jewish communal leaders, right, and they're listening to this, and I know they all are, what should we, where should they focus their energies then, right? Like what should we be doing to combat all of this? You know, the rise of anti-Semitism is on the left, it's on the right. They're terrible. What should we be doing differently?
Really good question. Three things. First off, Jewish early education. I would not be who I am today if I didn't have Jewish early education. I had Jewish education K through 12, and I know that's not a reality for everyone, but if Jewish kids are having a Jewish education up until maybe fifth grade, it completely changes the way that they understand their Jewish identity and the way that they
Mm,
relate with the world from outside because something else is inside of them, right? I always say, when I promote birthright, I love birthright, we're reaching them too late. We're reaching them at the first time that they're in loco parentis, right? The first time they're on their own, because that's the first time that we can reach them on our own. But we
right,
really have to be reaching out to the parents, telling them you're in charge of your child from 0 to 18. We need to reach them sooner. And that I think is going to be groundbreaking and game changing. We wouldn't have to send college kids on birthright if they understood their Jewish identity from K through fifth grade.
right.
Number one. Number two, political activation. And the Syrian community is finally doing this. I think
Okay.
that the Jewish communities have, for the large part, kind of kept in the background or have lobbied, which is great. We don't need to lobby politicians. We don't need to take politicians to Israel. We need to be running our own candidates. And the Syrian community realized that. You can try to convince someone of your values or tell them why their values are actually aligned with yours and they should support your cause. Or you can put someone from your own community in office and support them and put those resources into them, and they'll advocate for you better than anyone else. And that is a plain truth. And the Syrian community just ran their first candidate last term, and he won New York State Assembly. And hopefully, the next step is going to be Congress and then Senate. And then hopefully, we'll be able to have a nice Syrian Jewish constituency in leadership in the United States. We need to stop lobbying politicians. We need to start activating ourselves. But of course, we can't do it alone. So, number three is what I was talking about before, those unlikely allies. We need to start
Mhm.
finding them and we need to start building those bridges. And even if it's just in a relatively shallow way at the beginning, showing them that your values are aligned, but that's the way that you start real relationships. And you're not asking for anything. You're saying, hey, our community was hurting. We understand your community is hurting. How can we help? How can we help? What can we do to make your experience easier than the one that we had 5 years ago after October 7th?
Mm,
And that opens the conversation. So
yeah,
if you're a community leader, Jewish education, political activation of our own, and making unlikely allyships.
that's great. That's great. So I like that a lot. That's super helpful. I think that, the question of allyship of the three to me is the one that I keep coming back to. I mean, in terms of like
Mhm.
I just don't know because when you study history, you see that the Jewish people did leaned very heavily on the allyship muscle. And I think
Yeah.
part of the disappointment after 10/7 was like we've been allies, at least in our own eyes, for so long, for decades. And that didn't really work out well. So I think there might be some lessons to be, learned in that whole thing. But I do take from this, the education. Sure, of course, I agree. Political activism in that sense is a new one for me. I admit. But these are great. These are great, Adele. So what are areas do you think that we are getting some things right? And how do we know that we're moving in that direction in terms of progress? In other words, it's good to give big categories. Okay, and the Syrian community is a great example, right? But the Jewish establishment moves like establishments do, glacially. And so what I'm trying to parse out is
Mhm.
actual next steps, actual recommendations, kind of pushing it one step further. Okay, great. How do we do that? How do we get into like what is the need? I'm gonna put education aside because neither I don't know if that's like an expertise where I feel like it would be worthwhile pursuing that answer, right? In terms of like how to make education affordable, as an example, right? Political activism, great, and allyship. So those are two where I think is I'd be curious to hear a little bit more, kind of drilling down.
Yeah, well, the first one, political activation, right? So how did the Jewish community do it? Well, they realized first off that the Syrian Jewish community makes up a very large part of Brooklyn. It does,
Mm,
just geographically and demographically, it makes up a very large part of Brooklyn, but not enough where a Republican candidate can win. Syrian Jews vote right. They almost always have. So the first step for us was to have them realize if we try to vote a Republican candidate in, they will lose. They will lose
mm,
just because of what Brooklyn is. What
right.
we need to do is run someone who is a progressive Democrat from our community that can reach our community and others with their democratic values and interests that they're looking for, which, by the way, education was one. They wanted to increase funding for education, which Syrians want too, because our schools, which are private schools and some of them charter, are extremely expensive. Right. So we said we need more grants for education, which other communities, ethnic communities in Brooklyn were also looking to have.
Hmm.
And also, they're going to have the Israel value, but it's not going to be any of their forefront policies because we already know that they align with us with the Israel value. So the
Mm,
first step was getting everyone to register to vote Democrat. We knew the real battle would be the primary. And that is really hard. And guess what? We ran our very first candidate and we lost. Unfortunately, we could not win that first Democratic primary.
okay.
And that was a shame. What ended up happening was about a year and a half later, there ended up being a special election and a seat was open. And the
Mm,
Jewish community, the Syrian community, which had been hearing about that first primary for the whole summer before leading up to election day, we said, hey, remember how we lost? We can win now. And we activated everyone. And we told everyone, we held events, like fun social events, and we said, you can't come unless you've registered to vote. Fun social community events. We didn't
yeah,
say who to vote for. They
right.
knew. But we said, hey, this is a place where you can only come if you've registered to vote. And that seemed to really help because the whole community activated itself. We got Syrian Jews to register as Democrat, which is insane. And then we got them to try an election. It didn't work. And then we had that special election. We all rallied behind, we activated, and we put someone in office. That was
Amazing.
a really great process. So I think it's a matter of understanding that you're not going to be leaning with the Israel and anti-Semitism policy. You're not going to try to convince Jews to vote for this person because they should already be on board. And it's going to be hard to find that person in the community that isn't like the Syrian Jewish community. You have to find someone that's like, hey, I already align with you in XYZ. So my policies might be a little bit uncomfortable for you. They might be a little bit more on the left side, or they might be a little bit more on the right side, depending on the other demographic I'm trying to hit. And that's how you get that person elected, practically speaking.
Interesting. So we
Yeah.
talked a lot about all kinds of changes. We talked about changes in systems, in the legal definitions. We talked about communal organizing. We talked about allyship. This has been incredibly rich, and this is we're coming to a close here. So I want to ask, one, it's a combined question, I guess. And the title of this episode, the name of this episode, is the Long Path podcast, right? And we draw that right from the source and how we understand our journey through the time as the Jewish people. And I think that like we are in a moment where we have to take stock of the direction in which we're going. And I think that what I'd like to hear from you, and this is a two-part of it, is how would you describe the biggest internal change that the Jewish community needs to go through, okay, in order that we can put ourselves in the path of where we want to be, okay? And then describe to us what happens if we don't go in that path, right? So what is the change that happens internally for us? And then if we do it, great, this is what happens. If we don't do it, this is where we might be heading.
And that's a good question. I think what we have to realize is the concept of a lifeboat, which means that we're all on the same boat. And whether you think one way or another, if the boat sinks, we all sink together. And I think that that comes from the false sense of safety that a lot of people had here in the United States, thinking as long as I think the right things, I should be safe. And
Mm,
October 7th was a moment they realized that wasn't necessarily true. And suddenly they were nothing but Jewish. And I think the more we realize that we are on this lifeboat together, we can learn to steer it in the direction we want to go. But first, everyone has to realize that Judaism is a communal religion. It's not an individual religion. It's not that I am Jewish on my own. It's about me, my faith, and my mind, which a lot of religions are, right? You just have to accept Christ into your heart. You have to recognize Allah as the highest power, right? And his prophet Muhammad. It's not about you as an individual. It's about being Am Yisrael. It's about being a nation, B'nai Yisrael, and we're all on the lifeboat together. And Judaism being a communal religion, I think we were talking about all the way at the beginning, that's what it is. We're the peoplehood. And being a
Mhm.
peoplehood means we sink or swim together. So I think that if we don't realize we're all on the lifeboat together and we start veering off that path, then we're going to go in every single direction and we will sink. You're going to have people saying, well, as long as we're the good Jews that denounce Israel, or as long as we're, the strong Jews that fight for Israel in every space, or as long as we're the Jews that connect with our inner self and make Aliyah, you're going to be leaving someone behind and they're going to crash and burn. And ultimately, we're all going to crash and burn together. I think that there's no correct way to Jew. But the first way to Jew is by realizing you're not a Jew on your own.
Beautiful. Adela, thank you so much for joining us. This was a delight, very enriching. Again, mazal tov on your engagement.
Thank you. Of
But this has been really enlightening and truly wonderful. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for your time. And thank you for joining us on the Long Path podcast.
course, thank you so much, Amitai, and thank you everyone for listening.
So thank you for joining us in that episode, that conversation with Adela Cojab. It was incredibly rich, a lot of detail, high energy, and I always learn a lot from my conversations with Adela. And my takeaway from this episode actually came towards the end of the conversation. She evoked this really powerful imagery of being in the same lifeboat. Sometimes we talk about a big tent Judaism, we talk about all these different ways to think about the borders or boundaries of our community, but the lifeboat, there's something very powerful about that because it really puts up front what's at stake. What's at stake if we can't stay together, if we can't figure out ways to overcome our differences, if we start casting people out? There's a lot of real life situations in which this is very, very powerful. So that's my takeaway from this episode. And my question for you today is, how do we remind ourselves that we are in fact in a lifeboat together? In moments of tension, of friction, of argumentation, when we think that the person in our community is doing something incredibly wrong, an institution, how do we remind ourselves that we are in fact all together in this lifeboat? Thanks for listening to the Long Path podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow the show and share this episode with someone who would find it meaningful. Conversations like these really only grow through community. You can watch the full episode on YouTube and find clips and updates on TikTok and Instagram. And before we go, a big thank you again to Adela Cojab for joining us today. Thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. Thank you to our production team for making this happen. Again, the best way to support this effort is to subscribe and share it with your friends and family. And we'll see you next week. I'm your host, Amitai Freeman. This has been the Long Path Podcast. Have a great day.